Hello everyone, welcome back to Altengrad city in City Skylines. We are almost done with the 1950s. Last time we built the large industrial zone, expanded the existing industry and talked about all the relevant historical background. Today we will do a very special project that we haven't done in any of the series yet. We will move far away from the city into a completely empty area where we will build an open pit mine and next to it a cement factory. With this episode, we are going to start our little journey towards the mass manufacturing of concrete buildings, which we will cover in detail in later episodes. Also, I want to mention that as a materials engineer, this topic is close to what I do in real life, so that's also why I'd like to make these episodes. Concrete and cement were nothing new by the 1950s. After the Second World War, it started to quickly become a dominant material for absolutely everything, from bridges to benches or streetlights. With the expansion of heavy industry, as we talked about it last time, it was also needed in very large quantities for power generation projects, such as dams, infrastructure like bridges, canals, tunnels, and it was already clear that it would play a key role in ordinary building construction, replacing classic bricks. All of this meant that new cement factories needed to be made to satisfy the need to make more concrete. So let's talk about how cement is made, what the factory even does, and why it looks the way it does. Right at the start, it's important to say that there are different types of cement. The one I'm talking about is Portland cement, apparently named like that because it resembles the mined stones at the Isle of Portland in England. This is the most common type, and unless said otherwise, it is what people mean when saying cement. The main ingredient for making it is limestone, which is required in very large quantities, so it's mined very close to the factory. And the mine can only be where a geological survey confirms the presence of suitable deposits. Not every mine produces the exact same chemical composition of the rocks, so different cement factories can use various other inputs like slate, clay, or iron ore, some of which need to be brought in by railway. The materials mined at the site are crushed and moved, usually by conveyor belt, to the first very large storage warehouse where, by carefully piling them, they are roughly mixed in the desired ratios. This mixture is then put onto another conveyor belt and moved into a mill, where it's milled into a powder and then stored in silos together with some other admixtures that improve the final chemistry of the raw input. Let's pause this explanation for a minute because I really want to just talk about the mine, making the mine, before we move to build the factory itself. So, as you can see, the mine is already taking shape and it's actually surprisingly easy to do this. Now, what I'm doing in here is I'm using a map texture for sand. As you can see, it is sand. I'm using the sand painter in here. And I used the theme that makes it look like snow. I'm not exactly sure what the map theme is called for the snow. You probably could have seen it there, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to be changing it to something different. I don't particularly like this texture. It's a bit too white. Limestone is white, but not this much, right? So I'm just going to be using something different later. But anyway, at the start, I was painting the different levels of the mine with shelters for railway stations. The reason for that is that they were visible, right? But later, when I was done with the shape, I converted them into terraforming networks. And you can do that. You can, change these decorative networks to different ones. So I could not have painted it with a road, for example, because it's not a decorative network. So I had to do it like this. And then I'm just using these terraforming networks to create these very mine-looking shapes. So they are very rough and creating these like stairs inside the mine. The mine is not particularly large, as you can see, and I'm just, doing these kinds of detailed landscaping changes all around it, so it really blends together with the surrounding detail. As you can see in this particular project, I kind of broke my rule of not changing the terrain when continuing building Altengrad, but, there was no other way. This project kind of required that. So anyway, we are going to return to the mine a bit later when detailing it further, but right now we are just going to move and start building the factory. So let's return to the introduction. So now that we have the raw material prepared, it's time to burn it. This is done in a rotary kiln, which is a huge metal pipe with a ceramic inside, around 100 meters long, but different factories have different sizes and numbers. Some have one large, some have many smaller ones. The kiln is placed horizontally with a slight angle and it rotates, so the material flows forward. At the start of the kiln, there is a heat exchanger, usually very tall. It can resemble a very tall system of silos, or it can be inside like a building. Usually, older cement factories are done like that. Here, the material gets transported all the way to the top and falls down while getting warmer and drier. Inside the kiln, at the start, there are a couple of hundreds of degrees Celsius, so all the remaining water evaporates in here, even the water that is chemically bound to the mixture. As the material flows further, the temperature increases to around 1000 degrees Celsius, where the chemical reactions start. And lastly, it reaches the end of the kiln, where there is the flame jet, so the temperature is the highest here of around 1450 degrees Celsius. It's important that this temperature is close around this value, otherwise the process won't work very well. At this temperature, the material starts to sinter, which means that it's so hot that the individual grains start to slightly melt on the outside, so they fuse with each other, but it will never fully liquefy. This process results in the correct chemical reaction that creates the main cement compounds that react with water in the finished thing. After the sintered material leaves the kiln, it must be crushed because it is now in the form of larger fused grains, and relatively quickly cooled because cement is not stable at very high temperatures and the created compounds could lose their reactivity if left hot. The final step is another milling process where it gets milled to a fine powder so it can properly react with water when used. After that, it's stored in silos, waiting to be loaded onto trains, trucks, or bagged. These days, some cement types are also at this stage mixed with other admixtures to create some special cements for various applications. Technological advances obviously played a huge role in manufacturing of cement. These days, the analysis of raw materials is much easier and more accurate. We have all kinds of means of getting the exact chemical composition information. For example, using X-rays or gamma rays, and even continuously on the conveyor belts. The heat exchangers at the start of the rotary kilns are also way more advanced today, and much bigger as well, which limits the heat losses and saves energy. It is said that cement production makes around 8% of global CO2 emissions. Roughly one half comes from burning fuels to heat the kiln. This can be limited to some degree or maybe even eliminated with the use of electrical heaters using energy from renewables. Advances to make these processes more efficient, limit all the heat losses, are still being made in this regard. But the other half of emissions comes from the chemical reaction when calcium carbonate of the limestone breaks down. This cannot be eliminated, although there are experiments with carbon capture technologies these days. I think I've read about a factory in Norway trying it on an actually useful scale lately. But this issue can also have different solutions, like using more admixtures as partial replacement for cement. Mostly secondary, sometimes called waste, materials like coal ash, reactive steel slag, and other industrial secondary products. And of course, more efficient use of cement, better, more durable concretes, and proper design of structures so they don't fall apart after a couple of decades. So this is it. That's how cement is and was made. I'm planning to continue by building a concrete plant with a prefabrication factory in some future episodes. So we will continue talking about concrete, modern concrete technology, and prefabrication, which will then be followed by the prefab housing. But now let's return to City Skylines, to Altengrad, and see what we are building here. So at first I was absolutely clueless and completely lost. I had no idea how I'm ever going to build such a factory because there is nothing like this in the workshop, and I do believe that in the vanilla game there is a rotary kiln, but probably for like a different purpose, different factory, so not exactly resembling like a cement factory. So I obviously had to create everything from scratch from procedural objects, so I really had to get really creative. I was searching some factories from real life that I could take inspiration from, and I did manage to find one that was actually built at the late 1950s, start of the 60s in the Czech Republic. And it looked pretty much exactly like this, even though not accurately, because like I said, I have to be creative. I have to use all the wrong buildings to just mash them together and create this. So I'm using heavily these brick factory buildings made by Evania, the ones that I've been using very frequently in the industrial zones all around the city. And I made it into procedural objects and turned it into this tower. Now this white tower, that would be where the heat exchanger is in front of the rotary kilns. Now the kilns are obviously these tubes that I'm doing right here. I chose two because, why not? They are kind of small, I suppose. They could have been a bit longer. Now, by the way, the tubes are made from a chimney or smokestack made by Ronix, if I'm not mistaken. I was just getting rid of some of the ladders on it, so it doesn't really look like a smokestack anymore, but just like a generic looking steel tube. Now, in front of the tower, or at the back of the tower, however you look at it, there are the silos. Now, those would be the silos for the milled, raw powder that then gets transported to the top of the tower and falls down into the heat exchanger and into the rotary kiln. Now, as you can see, I really had to be creative there with the connections of these various buildings. So, for example, the tops of the silos were not exactly looking right, so I just put that warehouse building on top, which is actually how it's done in that real-life factory that I took inspiration from. And then I really had no idea how to obviously do the heat exchangers, so I'm just thinking that it's inside that building. Again, not like super accurate because it would kind of be visible. The building is not like a traditional building. Is just like a structure that you can see through and you can see what's inside. But, I would never be able to just construct all the details from scratch like this. So this is good enough, I suppose. Now the rotary kilns, again, are not really originating from insides of the building, but they are just cutting into the facade of that white tower. So I decided to put that corrugated metal roof in there, just like covering the start of the kilns. So, it looks okay. And then the kilns are going into that warehouse building that, again, is just put there so that it's going to cover the end of the kiln. So I don't need to construct all the coolers, all the crushers, and all of that. So, you just need to use your imagination that all the technology is hidden inside in these warehouses. And I think it works. It's, it's looking like a factory, this place, and it's kind of built with minimal effort, I would say, because all of these procedural object things and changes are really not that super complicated. So, surprisingly not complicated project, this one. I was really afraid that I would have to go ham with all the procedural objects and create all kinds of pipelines and just all the technology, but nope, I'm just hiding it in these buildings, so that's nice. So anyway, that's the main building, and then after that, by the way, this warehouse on the left, that would be the large primary storage of the raw materials that I talked about. And later I'm going to connect it to conveyor belts, and I'm just going to stretch those conveyor belts all the way to the mine. So that's where the raw limestone and some of the other materials would be transported. Railway is, of course, very much needed in such factories, so I'm just, doing a couple of tracks in here, and I also tried, I did put a real working train station, cargo train station inside, but this time it's not working, so I guess I made a mistake, so I'm not really showing it because I don't really want to give anyone any ideas that that's the proper technique of making custom cargo stations, because I'm still not exactly sure. So it was just an experiment, it doesn't work. I'm probably going to try to get to the bottom of it later with some different projects, maybe the harbor or something like that. But yeah, right now it's not working. But the factory is not really, like, gameplay wise, not going to be that large, so trucks are going to be absolutely fine, just delivering the gameplay cargo in and out of the factory. So they are going to be using a road, and this is exactly where I'm going to make it. At first I was thinking that I'm just going to make it parallel to the train tracks, but I already had like a farm field, like a mud path in here going, just like a decorative network really. But it was connected to that main road leaving the city, so I just continued it in here. And just like with that factory that I took inspiration from, it also has this like an access point or it has a bridge over or under the the bridge is for the railway, but the road goes underneath it there finally. And it's just like a super simple detailing project. As you can see, a couple of these procedural object concretes and concrete blocks, and that's it. I don't really need to detail it because it's not necessary. I'm not going to be focusing on it, but it's going to be there. So if you zoom out, you're going to see it. So it needs to be at least, somewhat there. Now, the main office building, the main administration building is this, I believe, a building made by Meister Monis. It's like a East German, generic office building of the 60s, 70s, so it might be a bit newer, but again, it's generic enough that we can pass it for like late 1950s or early 60s structure. I suppose I didn't mention that, but I already touched that in the previous episode, that this particular project that we are doing here is not like super necessary to be made in the 1950s, but then again, it doesn't hurt to do it in the 50s. Now, this is something that I didn't mention, but it's very important, and a lot of people asked me about it in the comments, like, when am I finally going to have proper asphalt texture in Altengrad? I won't, okay? But I am going to be switching for asphalt textures and concrete textures from the cobblestones in places where it makes sense. So every time we are going to expand the city into like very recently built places, new places, I'm going to switch for these textures, just like I'm doing over here, because it would make zero sense to make this place with cobblestone, right? Because it's like a completely from scratch built area, so it would be already done using the modern materials. I suppose I could have done that in the previous episode as well with the expansion of the industrial zone, but I kind of didn't want to because a couple of cinematics there were still showing the old parts of the city, and obviously I cannot just like suddenly switch to concrete pavement all around the city, right? So I paid attention so that this pavement texture is very similar in tone to the rest of the city, so that when I'm going to zoom out, the city is not really going to change. And obviously at those levels, when we see the entire city, you don't see the individual cobblestones, so it doesn't matter. And I did exactly the same thing with the asphalt, so it's the same color, but it just doesn't look like cobblestone anymore. And like I said, I'm just going to be switching the map themes between different projects. No idea how I'm going to do any like first-person tram rides or something, because I'm probably going to have to like switch it along the way or something. But, well, we will see. It's going to be a challenge for the future. This is what I was hinting at earlier. I changed the texture of the sand into this one. I'm not exactly sure what this one is called, but it's much, much better. It's not as white, so it kind of resembles like a realistic limestone mine. Even the tint of the color is still not exactly correct, and obviously it's a bit too plain, right? So this one is a bit better because the sandy texture is not really that prominent. As you can see, you really have to push that brush so that it actually shows this texture, otherwise it has this like a muddy outline, which is okay. That's kind of what I wanted. I also did it, kind of sprinkled it around the factory, because the factory in real life would be super dusty, right? Really dirty of all the limestone and finished cement and all of that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do over here. But obviously I don't want to overlap the decals too much, otherwise it's going to look really terrible in the cinematics. Same goes for the mine. In there, I also used a couple of those piles, but the mine is really not that small, so I really didn't have patience to just detail with those piles absolutely everywhere. So I only did it around where the vehicles are to make it look like it's being loaded on the trucks, and they are just going to drive it towards that like a chute where it gets crushed and transported on the conveyor belts. So a couple of details as well, just like we always do in these kinds of areas. So, light posts, those are really going to make this place look stand out. And I don't think I did light posts last time, but this time I'm finally going to use those new ones that I'm not really sure if I used them in the city just yet. I think I did on the streets of that main avenue in the last episode. That was like the first time that I used it. I'm not exactly sure. Actually, no, I did that with that intersection, with that like old collapsed bridge. Well, now the new one. But yeah, right here, this is like a completely new area, so we are just going to use the very new light posts, and they look really good. It's like a very small detail, but it's going to finally put this project into the correct decade, right? So these little details is all that counts in this regard. Also, I'm doing some kind of trains in here, like parked vehicles. I downloaded a new wagon for this purpose, but I don't really have right now, I believe, in the late 1950s, any diesel locomotive. So I just put like a prop of a steam one, which, they would still be running in this time period. So there's no problem with that. These are the finished cinematics. Here you can see the scale of the mine, of the factory, and its position to the city, like in relation to the city. So it's a very far away project from the city. It needs to be, and also because I'm switching those map themes, the textures, so it makes sense that we are far away from the city. That just makes it much better. But now that I think of it, I probably should not have mentioned that I'm switching the textures, magicians and tricks and all of that. But oh well, it's out. So this is the finished mine. I'm really satisfied with it. It was really simple to build it. I know that there are different techniques of making these open pit mines. For example, with props, making the walls of the mine with props. But that kind of felt a bit too complicated. I did try it, but it was really complicated. And this was really easy. Just doing it, kind of painting it with the terraforming networks and just moving them around as you see fit. And, up and down as well. And it's absolutely fine. It's looking great, and together with this sandy texture, it's good. I suppose it's not like super realistically colored, but it's the best I can do. The factory I'm also very satisfied with because it does have that early 60s, late 50s look, especially because of that office building at the front, but also because of the smokestacks. I believe that these are the Berlin smokestacks, and they look like spot on. They are these gray, they are obviously concrete chimneys already. No more brick chimneys anymore in the city, and they also have those. I'm not really sure, like airplane maybe warning painting or something. I'm not really sure what that's there for, but yeah, those checkered red and white paintings. That's something you don't really see on the brick chimneys. And here it's like just like with the streetlights, like a tiny detail that just puts the factory into the correct decade. These are the conveyor belts. By the way, the conveyor belts are just pedestrian paths changed with adaptive networks, because apparently these pedestrian paths have, with adaptive networks, you can put like a corrugated roof over them. So it actually does look like those tunnels for the conveyor belts. So, I'm just making do with what I have. Also, I made a bus line go into this area. It was already aiming into this place. It's an existing bus line that was ending somewhere in the city near the exhibition center. So I just stretched it all the way here, and a lot of people are using it in the game. So that's surprising. Well, not really, because it's pretty much the only way to get here. At first, I thought I'm going to make a train station in here, but nah, not really. It would just be a bit too small for that. So we did a bus station, so we have those nice little buses going in front of that administration building. So overall, a cute little project, I must say. Anyway, in the next episode, we are going to make a jump to 1960s. We are going to talk about architecture. We are going to revisit some empty and partially constructed places inside the city, and we are really going to do some modern buildings. All right, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching this episode of Altengrad. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please do all the all the usual things, thumbs up below the video, liking the video as well, and well, it's the same thing. Leaving a comment, sharing the video, subscribing, and if you want to directly support this, you can become a channel member. Huge thanks to all the supporters that we currently have. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you again. Goodbye.